When I refused to mortgage my house for my daughter's business, she tried to have me declared incompetent. Elaine Parker, retired accountant and mother for 33 years, didn't raise her voice in court. Melissa, the little girl whose lemonade stand I once built from scrap wood, sat beside her lawyer with a smile she thought was victorious. By morning, my own attorney would have filed the documents proving my full capacity, along with a petition to freeze the business accounts she'd been draining. I'd been both provider and parent, now I was the protector of my own future. And when the bank called in her loan, Melissa finally learned whose signature really mattered. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. Her voice was calm, but the request was like a stone thrown at my heart. The late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen blinds, striping the countertop where Eleanor was shelling peas into a ceramic bowl. The phone rang, its sharpness cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She wiped her hands on a dish towel before picking it up. "Hi, Mom." Claire's voice came, steady and almost pleasant, but threaded with that familiar undertone, like there was a weight she wanted Eleanor to carry before the call was through. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Hello, sweetheart. How's the shop?" There was a pause, just long enough to signal that the answer wouldn't be simple. "That's actually why I'm calling. Things have been rough. The investors backed out, and I'm on the edge here." Claire exhaled, a practiced sigh. "I need your help." Eleanor straightened, sensing the shift in air before the words landed. "What kind of help?" "I need you to take out a mortgage on the house," Claire said, her tone so level it could have been a request for a grocery run. "It's just temporary, until the business turns around." The bowl in Eleanor's lap suddenly felt heavy. She gripped its edge, as if anchoring herself. "Claire, that's a big step. My house. You've always said you believed in me," Claire interrupted. "Well, now's the time to prove it." Eleanor swallowed, feeling the knot in her throat tighten. "I can't risk my home, but I can help in other ways. Let's go over your budget. Maybe we can restructure things." "No, Mom." Claire's voice sharpened, the calmness fraying at the edges. "I need real help. I need the money. You owe me this." The words hit harder than she expected, dredging up years of late-night rides to dance rehearsals, scraped knees cleaned, bills paid quietly, so Claire wouldn't see her mother's sacrifices. Eleanor stared at the blinds, light and shadow cutting across her vision, and thought of the decades she'd spent making sure her daughter never fell too hard. "I've always done everything I could for you," Eleanor said softly, "but I can't do this." There was silence, dense, waiting. When Claire spoke again, her voice was brittle. "I knew you'd make this about you." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter, feeling the space between them stretch. "I'm offering you my advice, my time." "I don't need advice," Claire snapped. "I need someone who believes in me enough to take a risk." "If you can't even do that," her breath hitched. Or maybe it was just static on the line. "Maybe you're not the mother I thought you were." Eleanor closed her eyes. The words weren't just sharp, they were meant to. In her mind, a question circled like a restless bird. How much of my life does she think she owns? The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was the tense quiet before a storm. Eleanor knew the conversation had shifted into dangerous territory. Finally, Claire's voice came again, lower now, almost deliberate. "If you refuse, you'll lose everything." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone, her pulse echoing in her ears. She didn't know yet what everything meant, but the way Claire said it made her skin prickle. The line went dead, leaving Eleanor alone in the striped light of her kitchen, the words still hanging in the air like a curse. She turned up the heat, but I refused to fold under pressure. The next morning, Eleanor's phone buzzed before the sun had fully crept over the rooftop. A text from Claire blinked on the screen. "You'll never understand what it takes to keep something alive." By the time Eleanor had made coffee, another message appeared. "You've never risked everything for someone else the way I have for my business." The words sat on the screen, like accusations, daring her to answer. Eleanor typed and erased 3 different replies before finally setting the phone face down on the counter. She wasn't going to be pulled into a battle fought in half sentences and guilt. But the texts kept coming hourly, sometimes in bursts. Screenshots of sales charts, invoices, clipped remarks about how real family shows up when it matters. Eleanor's chest tightened each time, but she forced herself to keep moving through her day. She folded laundry, watered the basil in the window, read the same paragraph of a novel 3 times without absorbing a word. By the 3rd day she called Claire, determined to speak plainly. "Claire," she began, voice steady, "this isn't about whether I love you. It's about what you're asking me to risk. When you use words to make me feel guilty, that's not fair." Claire sighed, a sound of long-suffering patience. "Mom, you always twist things to make yourself the victim. I'm not manipulating you, I'm asking for help. Help that could cost me my home," Eleanor replied. "You're overreacting," Claire said briskly. "This is temporary, you just can't see the bigger picture." The conversation ended with neither of them moved an inch closer. 2 days later, Eleanor pushed open the door of the little corner cafe, the one with mismatched mugs and a constant smell of cinnamon. Ruth was already at their usual table, her reading glasses perched low as she flipped through a newspaper. "You look like you've been chewing on something sour for a week," Ruth said, folding the paper. Eleanor laughed without humor and told her everything about the mortgage, the texts, the way Claire's words were beginning to sink in like rain through old plaster. Ruth's brow furrowed. "Eleanor, you've spent your whole life giving that girl everything she needed, and now she's asking for what you can't afford to give. You sacrifice your home, and I promise you, she'll never see it for what it's worth." Eleanor stirred her tea, watching the steam curl upward. "Am I wrong for saying no?" "No," Ruth said firmly. "You'd be wrong to say yes." Her friend's certainty should have been a bomb, but as Eleanor walked home, the doubt still gnawed. That night she sat at the kitchen table and opened an old photo album. Claire at 6, with paint on her cheeks. Claire at 16 in her prom dress. She had always been the one to smooth the path, to patch the holes before her daughter tripped. Was this the first time she'd truly refused? The texts changed tone, no more long explanations, just short barbs. "Thanks for showing me what support looks like. Don't worry, I won't bother you with my problems anymore." Days passed without a call. The house was quieter than usual, but the silence had a sharp edge to it, like glass waiting to break. Eleanor felt the familiar tug of wanting to fix things, to call and make it right, but she also felt something new. A line had been drawn, and she wasn't ready to cross it. One evening, she sat in the living room with the lamplight pooling on the rug, her knitting resting in her lap. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text about sales or disappointment. It was one line, cold and precise. "If you don't help me, I'll have you declared incompetent." Eleanor stared at the words, the blood rushing in her ears. It wasn't just heat anymore, it was fire. She set the phone down slowly, her hands trembling, and whispered to the empty room, "So this is how far she's willing to go." Her words were like a knife in my back, and I didn't even see it coming. Eleanor told herself she wasn't going to dignify the threat with a response. She placed the phone in the drawer beside her checkbook, shut it firmly and went to bed without another glance. But the words had already sunk into the soft, unguarded places inside her, and no amount of bravado could keep them from stinging. At Sunday dinner, the air was sharp enough to slap. The family gathered at her sister-in-law's house, roast chicken, potatoes, glasses clinking, but Claire barely looked her way. She laughed too loudly at Max's stories, passed the bread, without making eye contact, and when Eleanor tried to ask about the shop, Claire answered with one-word replies. Eleanor forced her own smile, nodding along to conversations she wasn't part of, feeling as though she'd been moved to the edge of her own family. Later in the kitchen she cornered Max while he was loading the dishwasher. "Has your sister said anything to you?" she asked quietly. Max shifted the plates with more force than necessary. "I'm not getting in the middle, Mom. I'm not asking you to take sides, you kind of are." He straightened, meeting her gaze. "I just think maybe, let it cool off. You two will figure it out." The neutral tone hurt more than if he'd taken Claire's side outright. She felt the gap widening, the space where her children once stood shoulder to shoulder now divided by something she couldn't name. The following week, Ruth stopped by unannounced, her coat still dusted with February snow. She brought a loaf of sourdough and a look that meant she'd been thinking. "Eleanor," she said after they'd settled with tea, "I know you want to believe she's just blowing off steam, but I've seen people follow through on threats like that. If she's serious about the incompetency thing, you need to be ready. Eleanor shook her head, but Ruth pressed on. Talk to a lawyer. It doesn't mean you're going to war. It just means you'll know where you stand. That night, Eleanor lay awake, her mind turning over every moment of the past month. She thought about the way Claire had always known just how to push, how to make her feel like saying no was a betrayal. But this was a different animal. 2 days later, she spread her financial documents across the dining table. Bank statements, pension records, insurance policies, all neatly stacked, but suddenly looking more fragile than she'd ever considered. She started tracing through withdrawals and transfers from the last few years. There it was, plain as ink, the slow bleed of short-term loans she'd given Claire, always with the promise of repayment that never came. When she added it up, the total was enough to make her chest tighten. Her eyes drifted to the manila folder marked Will and Estate. She hadn't looked at it since the last update, over a year ago. Flipping through the notarized pages, she paused at a clause she didn't remember discussing. It outlined the primary beneficiaries. Max's name was there, Ruth's trust for the grandkids, but not Claire's. The absence hit like a cold wave. She searched the margins, the addendums, even the initialed notes. No trace. She tried to remember the meeting with her old lawyer the way she'd been tired that day, signing where the tabs told her to without reading every line. Had it been an oversight, or had she, somewhere deep down, already begun protecting herself? She closed the folder slowly, her reflection caught in the dark glass of the cabinet door. She looked older than she felt, more worn, yes, but steadier too. The kitchen clock ticked in the quiet, marking the seconds between the Eleanor who let things slide, and the Eleanor who was done letting anyone, even her daughter, write her story for her. She picked up the phone, thumb hovering over her contacts, until it landed on law offices of Kendall and White. Her hand was steady when she pressed call. As the receptionist transferred her to an appointment line, Eleanor's gaze fell back to the folder on the table. The ink on those pages had been dry for over a year, but now it felt like the first move in a game she hadn't realized she was playing. I thought it was just a formality, but it turned into a confrontation. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt longer than it should have. Eleanor watched the floor numbers tick upward, her reflection in the brushed metal doors, looking faintly unfamiliar, shoulders squared, mouth set in a line that didn't quite waver. She told herself this was just an administrative check, a way to be certain the will was clear and the finances untangled. But deep down, the pulse in her throat warned her it would be more than that. The receptionist ushered her into a corner office, where morning light pooled over a walnut desk. Behind it sat Martin Keene, a lawyer in his late 50s, with eyes that missed nothing. He shook her hand firmly, invited her to sit, and began leafing through the folder she'd brought. "Your documents are in order for the most part," he said, scanning the pages, "but I need to make you aware of something unusual." Eleanor leaned forward. "Unusual?" He turned one page toward her. "There was an attempt, unsuccessful, but recorded, to transfer part of your assets to a business entity last year. The request came through a third party, but the paperwork was telling. The beneficiary listed was registered to your daughter's company." Her breath hitched before she could stop it. She tried to recall any conversation, any hint Claire had given, but nothing surfaced except the memory of her daughter's cool voice on the phone, asking for the mortgage. Martin continued carefully. "It was denied, of course, because the authorization wasn't in your handwriting, and the notary signature didn't match. But it's a red flag. If you haven't already, you may want to add clauses that prevent anyone from accessing or redirecting your estate without explicit in-person approval." Eleanor nodded, though her thoughts were splintering in all directions. Claire hadn't just been pushing for money, she'd been maneuvering around her for longer than Eleanor had realized. Martin asked a few more questions about family relations. When Eleanor explained the tension, his expression grew sharper. "Has your daughter been limiting your contact with other relatives, suggesting you're forgetful, making small comments about your memory?" The words landed with a strange weight. Eleanor pictured Claire at family gatherings, the sideways glances, the small jokes about mom's mix-ups. She thought of the way her sister had asked if she was feeling sharp lately, the way Max had urged her to just let things cool down. "She's been planting seeds," Eleanor murmured. Martin nodded grimly. That's a common tactic in competency disputes. It builds a narrative before anyone ever sets foot in court. By the time they were finished, Eleanor had authorized amendments to her will's specific guardrails, co-signature requirements, and a trust structure that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to act without her consent. Signing those documents felt like both an act of defense and a quiet grief. As she gathered her coat, Martin hesitated, then reached for another file. There's one more thing I think you should know. We did some due diligence when reviewing your document. My office found that your daughter has been in contact with a private investigator, someone who specializes in gathering evidence for guardianship and incompetency cases. Eleanor's fingers froze on the buttons of her coat. She's already started. I can't tell you what she's commissioned him to do, Martin said, but the connection is there. It suggests she's building a case. For a moment the room seemed to narrow, the city noise outside falling away. Eleanor pictured Claire, flipping through some stranger's file on her life, highlighting moments to twist into proof. A lifetime of love bent into a weapon. She inhaled slowly, forcing the air deep into her lungs until the edges of the panic dulled. Then she straightened, smoothing the front of her jacket. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steel as she told herself, I won't let her win. A letter in the mailbox wasn't about taxes, it was about control. The envelope was thick, the kind that came with bad news. Eleanor found it wedged between a grocery flyer and an electric bill, her name printed in black, impersonal type. The return address made her stomach dip. Harrison and Lowe, attorneys at law. She hadn't heard of them, but something about the formality of it felt like a gauntlet being thrown. Inside, the letter was brief and brutal. Dear Ms. Gray, we are writing on behalf of our client, Ms. Claire Whitfield, to request that you submit to a comprehensive mental competency evaluation. This assessment is to be conducted by a court-approved psychologist and will serve to ensure your continued ability to manage personal and financial matters. No warm regards, no gentle lead-in, just the cold blade of implication. You're not fit to take care of yourself. She read it twice, then a third time, her vision sharpening with each pass. Claire hadn't just been playing at pressure. This was formal, documented. The kind of paper that could be waved in a courtroom. The ceramic mug in her hand felt suddenly too fragile. She set it down, hard enough to make the tea ripple, and walked to the phone. Ruth answered on the second ring, her voice brisk, as if she'd been waiting for Eleanor to call. She's done it, Eleanor said, the paper crackling in her fist. What's she done? Her lawyer wants me to take a competency test, says it's to ensure I can manage my affairs. Eleanor's voice caught on the last word, the humiliation of it almost worse than the threat itself. There was a beat of silence, then Ruth's voice low and fierce. You need to fight back, Eleanor. Don't let her take your life from you. It's not just the house anymore, Eleanor murmured. It's me. She wants me. That night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her, untouched but not ignored. Her mind began mapping the shape of this new battlefield. This wasn't about a struggling shop or a desperate daughter. It was about power, control disguised as concern. She thought of all the times Claire had gently corrected her in front of others, the way she'd once taken her car keys after a late dinner out, insisting it was for her safety. How many of those moments had been rehearsals for this? When Max came by 2 days later, Eleanor hoped he might offer some clarity. He listened as she laid the letter on the coffee table between them. I just think maybe you should go along with it, he said finally, his eyes on the envelope, not her. If you pass, then it's over. And if you don't, if I don't, she said, her voice sharp enough to make him look up. He held up his hands. I'm just saying, maybe this will put it all to rest. Claire's worried about you. Worried, Eleanor repeated. The word tasted like rust. Max, do you hear yourself? She's trying to take everything I've built. And you think I should make it easier for her? He sighed, leaning back. I don't want to be in the middle. She studied him, realizing with a pang how easily a narrative could be spun, how quickly even those who knew you could start doubting. Max wasn't an enemy, but he was already drifting toward her opponent. By the time he left, Eleanor's resolve had sharpened. She would not give Claire the satisfaction of cornering her. She would not stand in court, blindsided and unprepared. She went to her desk, pulled out a notepad and began writing names, professionals she trusted. People Ruth had recommended over the years. She found one circled from an old list: Dr. Leland Ross, neuropsychologist. The memory surfaced. He'd evaluated Ruth's father when similar accusations had been made, and his report had been airtight. Her hand didn't tremble when she dialed the number. As she waited for the receptionist to answer, she looked again at the letter on the table. It no longer looked like a sentence. It looked like a challenge. "Yes," she told the voice on the line. "I'd like to schedule an evaluation, and I want it in writing that I'm sound. I never expected it to come to this, but I wasn't backing down now." The first morning she walked into Diane Mercer's office, Eleanor realized this wasn't just about defending herself, it was about reclaiming herself. Diane, sharp-eyed and unshakable, asked no small-talk questions. "We start with the truth," she said, sliding a yellow legal pad across the desk. Eleanor began talking, the words pouring out in an unbroken stream, until her throat was dry. Eleanor hires an attorney and begins preparing for the legal battle. By the end of that first meeting, Diane had a strategy. "We fight their narrative with facts," she said. "Dates, decisions, proof of independence, everything in writing." They compiled bank statements, work history, property records, each document a brick in the wall Eleanor was building to protect herself. Claire's lawyer presents documents claiming Eleanor's inability to make decisions. The first volley came days later. A binder of 38 pages, every page marked with underlined accusations, erratic judgment, poor decision-making, financial recklessness. Old loans to Claire were reframed as proof of incompetence. Even helping with Claire's first apartment deposit 20 years ago had been twisted into evidence. Eleanor's lawyer counters, citing her history of sound decision-making and independence. Diane barely flinched as she flipped through. "They're grasping," she countered with Eleanor's work record, investment history, the charity gala she'd chaired, the meticulous way she'd handled her finances for decades. Letters of reference came from colleagues, neighbors, her physician, all testifying to her competence. The battle is emotionally draining, but Eleanor grows stronger with every argument. Each deposition chipped at her energy, but also honed her resolve. She learned to meet each question head-on, to pause before answering, to hold eye contact until the other person looked away. What began as a trembling defense turned into deliberate, grounded testimony. Ruth continues to support her, helping Eleanor document all communications. Ruth became her archivist, keeping printed copies of texts and letters, organizing them by date and subject. "Paper trails are our ammunition," she'd say over mugs of tea. Sometimes they'd exchange tired smiles at the absurdity of it all. Two women preparing evidence against Eleanor's own child, but the seriousness never left the room. Eleanor struggles with the idea that her daughter is trying to control her life, but her resolve hardens. At night, Eleanor would pass the framed photo of Claire's wedding, remembering the warmth in her chest as she'd fastened the last pearl button on her daughter's gown. The contrast to now was dizzying. That same daughter was trying to take not just her home, but the right to decide her own future. The ache was sharp, but no longer enough to make her bend. As the court date looms, Eleanor realizes that this fight isn't just about the house, it's about her autonomy. The realization came like a click in the lock. If Claire succeeded, every decision, where she lived, how she spent her savings, even her medical care could be taken from her. The house was symbolic, but her autonomy was everything. The air in the conference room before the hearing was tight with unspoken hostility. Eleanor sat beside Diane, her hands folded on the polished table. Across from her, Claire's lawyer slid a sealed folder across the surface, his expression unreadable. Diane opened it, scanning the first page before looking up. Inside was a psychological report claiming Eleanor's behavior was erratic and dangerous. "They thought they had me cornered, but I found an ally in the unlikeliest of places." Eleanor sat frozen as Diane turned another page of the report, the fluorescent light catching on the legal seal stamped at the bottom. Every paragraph read like a stranger's version of her, one who misplaced bills, repeated stories, and forgot appointments. None of it was true, but seeing it on official letterhead made her chest tighten. Diane didn't look rattled. "They're leaning hard on perception," she said finally. "Perception can be dismantled." From that moment, the fight shifted. Diane spent the next week combing through Eleanor's life, not for flaws, but for the proof of who she really was. Awards from her years in accounting, volunteer records from the community center, meticulous tax filings, every year like clockwork. She even interviewed Eleanor's doctor, who described her memory as remarkably sharp for any age. One by one, the cracks in the opposing narrative appeared. The investigator who'd shadowed Eleanor for behavioral observation had failed to disclose he'd once been a client of Claire's business, a conflict of interest that was now documented. Time-stamped photos that were meant to show her confused in a parking lot actually matched the exact moment she'd been looking for her keys in her purse, laughing according to the witness Diane found. When the file of counter-evidence began to outgrow the original report, Eleanor felt something she hadn't in weeks: balance. The real turning point, though, came unexpectedly. Max showed up on her porch one rainy evening, hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't ask to come in, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes downcast. "I've been wrong," he said quietly. "I thought I was staying neutral, but I was letting her pull me in. I'm sorry, Mom." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment Eleanor saw the boy he used to be, standing in their old kitchen after breaking a neighbor's window with a baseball. It wasn't full repair, not yet, but it was the first step. Max began showing up at meetings, sitting beside her in court, speaking openly to reporters when the case started drawing local attention. The attention was another shift. Articles appeared in the community paper. Local woman battles daughter over competency claim. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years sent letters, offering to testify about her reliability and independence. At first Eleanor felt the exposure like a draft through an open window, unwanted and cold, but then she saw how it worked, sunlight drying out the mold of Claire's accusation. In the courtroom, she no longer sat hunched, waiting for the blows. She sat upright, pen in hand, jotting notes, passing them to Diane with questions of her own. She began to recognize that her story didn't start with this trial, it stretched back decades. Late nights balancing ledgers at the kitchen table, walking into banks alone to negotiate terms for the house, navigating the sharp years after her husband's death without asking anyone for rescue. She'd always fought for her family, even when they didn't see it. During a late-night prep session, Diane closed the folder they'd been working through. "I need you to know," she said, "Claire's not done. If she can't win on competency, she may try to undermine you another way." "What else is there?" Eleanor, "Character attacks," Diane replied. "If they can't make you incapable, they'll try to make you untrustworthy." Eleanor felt the words settle, heavy but not crushing. She'd expected another blow. Now she was ready to see it coming. The next day in court began quietly enough. Claire sat with her attorneys, flipping through her own binder, her expression unreadable. Eleanor kept her gaze on Diane, steadying her breath as the judge called for closing motions. That's when Claire rose, her voice cool but carrying through the hushed room. "Your Honor, there's one more matter that must be addressed. My mother is being financially manipulated by her friend Ruth Collins." The words hit Eleanor like ice water poured down her spine. Around the courtroom, heads turned, the sudden weight of a new accusation thickening the air. Eleanor's fingers curled against the tabletop as she locked eyes with Claire, knowing this was the next front in the war, and it had just begun. "I was accused of manipulating my own money," and the courtroom went silent. The echo of Claire's words lingered in the hushed room like smoke after a match strike. Financially manipulated by Ruth Collins, Eleanor could feel every eye turn toward her, their gazes heavy with curiosity, suspicion, or outright judgment. Diane was on her feet almost instantly. "Your Honor, this is a new and unsubstantiated claim. We request clarification on the nature and source of this accusation before proceeding." The judge's brow lifted, but he motioned for Claire's attorney to speak. The man stood, buttoning his jacket, his voice even but sharp. "We have reason to believe Miss Collins has exerted undue influence over Miss Gray's financial decisions, encouraging her to restructure her will in a way that deprives her daughter of rightful inheritance." Eleanor's stomach turned. It wasn't just an attack. It was a twisting of the one relationship that had held steady through this storm. She glanced toward Ruth, who sat a few rows back. Her friend's jaw was tight, but her eyes steady, calm, were locked on Eleanor in silent solidarity. "I will answer this," Eleanor said quietly, leaning toward Diane. Her lawyer shook her head slightly. "Not yet, let them finish, and then we'll dismantle it piece by piece." Claire's attorney produced a thin folder. Inside were clipped snapshots of Ruth and Eleanor leaving the bank together, annotated with captions about private financial meetings. There was also an email exchange, one Eleanor vaguely remembered, where Ruth had offered to help her manage the numbers during a complicated tax season. To anyone reading with suspicion, it might have looked like control. To Eleanor it had been friendship, plain and simple. When it was their turn, Diane rose, her voice as precise as a scalpel. "Your Honor, Miss Collins has known Miss Gray for over 30 years. She is not a business partner. She is not a beneficiary of Miss Gray's estate. She has on occasion accompanied her to financial institutions for support, as friends often do, especially when facing personal legal matters." Still, the weight of the accusation pressed against Eleanor's chest. It wasn't just about legal defense now. It was about the insinuation that she couldn't even choose her own confidants without someone pulling her strings. During the recess that followed, Ruth crossed the aisle, ignoring the disapproving glance from a bailiff. She leaned down beside Eleanor's chair. "They can drag my name through the mud all they want, but you know, and they'll know, that you've never needed me to be anything but your friend." It was a simple truth, but it steadied Eleanor like a hand on her back. When the court reconvened, Diane began calling witnesses. Eleanor's banker, who testified that Ruth had no signing authority on any account. Her accountant, who confirmed Eleanor's taxes and investments had always been handled solely by her, and finally Ruth herself. On the stand, Ruth's voice was steady. "Eleanor is an independent woman who has managed her own life with more competence than most people I know. She doesn't need me to tell her what to do. She never has. I am here because she asked me to stand with her, not for her." Eleanor felt the tide shift slightly. The murmurs in the gallery softened. Even the judge seemed to watch Ruth with a careful eye. Back at the defense table, Diane leaned in. "We could keep chipping away at their accusations, but I think it's time to pivot to show malicious intent. If we can prove Claire is doing this for personal gain, we won't just win this point. We'll undermine her whole case." Eleanor nodded slowly. She could feel the ache in her ribs where the morning's blow had landed, but she also felt the steel knitting back together inside her. "Then that's what we do," she whispered. "She can take shots at my friends, my choices, but I'm not letting her tear down what's real." The judge lifted his gavel lightly, signaling a pause. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he said. "Court will resume at 3. The sound of wood meeting wood echoed through the chamber. Eleanor exhaled, the air tasting faintly of dust and tension. Around her, papers shuffled, chairs scraped, and Claire whispered with her lawyer. As Eleanor rose from her chair, she caught the faintest curl of a smile on Claire's lips, a silent warning that the next strike was already on its way. If this was going to end, it would end on my terms, not. The morning of the final hearing dawned low and gray, the kind of sky that made the courthouse's stone facade look even heavier. Eleanor stood in the hallway outside the chamber, folder clutched to her chest. Fear still fluttered under her ribs, but it was anchored by something harder, months of holding the line. Inside, the air felt taut, as if the room itself understood what was about to happen. Claire sat at her table, whispering to her attorneys, her profile composed, polished. Eleanor allowed herself one steady look, long enough to say, "I'm still here," without speaking. When the bailiff called her name, she crossed the floor and took the stand. The oath felt like ritual, the wood beneath her hands cool and smooth. Diane's opening questions came measured, giving her room to speak in her own cadence. Eleanor began with the early years, the double shifts after her husband's death, the nights balancing bills on the kitchen table while her children slept. She spoke of saving for Claire and Max's schooling, of buying her home without anyone to co-sign, of planting a garden she could see from the kitchen window. "I gave because I loved them," she said, her gaze fixed on the judge. But love doesn't mean surrendering your right to live your own life. Cross-examination came sharp and quick. Claire's lawyer leaned on the accusations from the day before. Isn't it true Miss Collins has influenced your financial decisions for years? Collins is my friend. Eleanor said evenly, she's influenced my courage when I needed it. The decisions are mine. Then Claire took the stand. Her voice was calm, almost fragile as she painted herself as the abandoned daughter, her mother distant, her mother's friends suspect. She spoke of being erased from the will, of feeling shut out from the family she claimed to be defending. Diane's rebuttal was a single question. Do you believe your mother is capable of managing her affair? Claire's hesitation was brief, but it landed like a dropped pin in the quiet. Eleanor's final turn came. She sat straighter, her voice carrying with a steadiness she didn't have months ago. This isn't a fight for control, it's survival. I've always done what was best for my family, even when it cost me dearly, but I won't hand over my future just to make someone else feel secure. That's not love, it's surrender. For the first time she saw the judge lean forward, his pen paused above the page. Then Max rose unexpectedly from the gallery. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge allowed it. Max stepped forward, shoulders squared but eyes downcast. I thought staying neutral was the right thing. I see now it wasn't. I let my sister's version of events stand without challenge, and that hurt my mother. She is the most capable person I know. It's time we all stop trying to control her life. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. Diane rose for her closing. Her tone was calm, but edged with steel. She spoke of documented history, of decades of competence, of the clear pattern of pressure and manipulation. She reminded the court that protecting autonomy was as vital as protecting the vulnerable, and that this case was about stripping a capable woman of her rights for financial gain. When she finished, the silence was absolute. The judge removed his glasses, folding them with deliberate care. This court finds that Ms. Eleanor Gray possesses full legal capacity and sound mental health. The claims brought forward are without merit. He paused, letting the words settle. Furthermore, his gaze cut to Claire. The petitioner's actions constitute an unlawful attempt to seize control of another's estate, without cause. Eleanor sat very still, her pulse loud in her ears. Claire's face had gone pale, her mouth a thin line. The judge's final words landed like a gavel before the gavel. Ms. Whitfield, you've lost. I didn't win out of vengeance. I won because I was finally seen. The words of the judgment were still ringing in Eleanor's ears as the courtroom emptied. Claire was ordered to pay all court fees and damages. It was over on paper, but Eleanor knew the battle had left marks that no ruling could erase. She remained seated for a moment longer, her palms pressed flat against the table. Relief seeped in slowly, like sunlight through heavy curtains. She had defended her home, her rights, her name, but the victory didn't taste sweet. It was steady, grounded. Outside, the air was sharp and bright. Max walked beside her down the courthouse steps. You did it, he said, almost cautiously. We did what we had to, Eleanor replied. There was no triumph in her voice, only the truth. Their relationship, though mended in places, would always carry the lines where it had been strained. When she reached home, the quiet felt different, not the tense, waiting quiet of the past months, but a settled stillness. She set her folder on the counter and just stood there, breathing. For the first time in a long while, the walls felt like protection, not a cage. That evening Ruth arrived unannounced, a bottle of red wine under her arm. She poured 2 glasses without a word, then raised her to truth, she said simply. Eleanor met her gaze, and to keeping it. They drank, talked and sat in stretches of comfortable silence. At one point Eleanor admitted, I thought winning would feel like triumph, but it feels like I can finally be seen for who I am. That's worth more than winning, Ruth said. Over the following weeks, Eleanor began to reclaim the pieces of her life that had been pushed aside. She replanted the herbs in her kitchen window box, started attending a watercolor class at the community center, and walked the river path each morning. These small rituals stitched something back together in her. Diane stayed in touch, calling weekly. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, future safeguards, updated documents, Other times Diane simply asked about Eleanor's garden or what book she was reading. Knowing she still had someone watching her back made the space ahead feel less daunting. The fear that had sat like a stone in her chest slowly loosened. She no longer woke in the middle of the night, imagining footsteps at the door, yet some things stayed tender. Certain songs, certain photographs, still brought a catch in her throat. One rainy afternoon, she opened a long unvisited storage box labeled Claire, School Years. Inside were drawings in crayon, track meet ribbons, and a folded piece of lined paper in a child's hand. Love you, Mom. You're the best. She traced the letters with her fingertip, feeling both the ache and the endurance of love that had once been simple. By early spring, her days had settled into a quieter rhythm. No depositions, no deadlines, no urgent legal call. The mailbox became unremarkable again. Just bills, catalogs, the occasional letter from a friend. Until one Wednesday morning, the usual stack slid through the slot: utility bill, grocery flyer, gardening catalog. But in the middle was a plain white envelope with her name written in familiar blue ink. Claire's handwriting. There was no return address, no hint of what lay inside. She carried it to the kitchen, the weight of it disproportionate to its size. For a long moment she only turned it over in her hands. Finally, she broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. We need to meet. One last time. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Eleanor set the letter down, her fingertips resting on the paper, unsure if the next chapter would bring closure or another fight she hadn't yet imagined. I agreed to meet her, but I didn't expect an apology. Eleanor read the letter again before picking up the phone. If there was going to be a meeting, it would be on her terms. When Claire answered, her voice was quieter than Eleanor remembered. One condition, Eleanor said. No lawyers, no threats. We talk as mother and daughter, or we don't talk at all. There was a pause, a breath that seemed to stretch the line between them. All right, Claire said. Just us. They chose a cafe halfway between their homes, neutral ground with wide windows and the smell of fresh bread in the air. Eleanor arrived first, choosing a table near the back where they wouldn't be overheard. She wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee, steadying herself with the warmth. Claire walked in a few minutes later. The change was visible before she even reached the table. The careful poise she'd worn in court was gone. Her shoulders were sloped, her eyes less sharp. She sat without fuss, her hands clasped together as if holding something fragile. Thank you for coming, Claire began. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She let the silence do its work. Claire's gaze dropped. I've had a lot of time to think about everything I said, everything I did. Her voice caught on the last word. It wasn't about helping my business anymore. It was about winning, about control. And I went too far. Eleanor's instinct was to cross her arms, to keep the shield up. But she forced her hands to stay on the table, open. You tried to take my life from me, Claire. Not just my house. Me. I know, Claire said, the admission almost a whisper. And I'm sorry. Not in the sorry you feel that way kind of way. I'm sorry because I was wrong. I hurt you. I betrayed you. And I can't take that back. The words were disarming in their plainness. Still, Eleanor didn't move toward them too quickly. You can say you're sorry, she said slowly. But forgiveness isn't something I hand out like change at a counter. Trust, she hesitated, letting the weight of the words settle. Trust is earned. Claire nodded, her eyes glistening. I understand. They sat in that delicate space, speaking in fits and starts. There were no raised voices, no legal terms, just fragments, memories of better years, acknowledgments of wounds. Claire admitted she'd believed her own narrative for so long she couldn't see past it. Eleanor admitted that part of her had feared she'd lost her daughter completely. At one point the waitress came by to refill their cups, glancing between them with a faint, curious smile, as if she could sense this was no ordinary conversation. When the coffee was nearly gone, Eleanor spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. I don't know what happens next. I can't pretend this never happened, but I'm willing to leave the door open, if you understand it may stay open just a crack for a while. Claire's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. That's more than I deserve right now. They didn't hug when they stood to leave. The space between them was still lined with old fractures, but it no longer felt like a wall. Outside, the afternoon light was soft, filtering through thin clouds. Claire walked toward her car, turning back once as if she might say something else. Then, thinking better of it, Eleanor watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading into the hum of traffic. Claire slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, her expression unreadable, leaving Eleanor with the uneasy knowledge that the next move, whatever it was, would be hers. Forgiveness is a slow burn, and I wasn't ready to rush it. The cafe meeting lingered in Eleanor's mind for days afterward, replaying in fragments, the way Claire's hands had stayed clasped, the tremor in her voice, the careful choice of words. It had been an apology, yet, but apologies didn't stitch wounds closed. They only marked the place where mending could begin. Some mornings she woke with a faint sense of possibility, like there might be a bridge between them after all. Other mornings the memory of court filings and accusations rose like a tide, washing away whatever softness had settled overnight. Forgiveness, she decided, wasn't a single act. It was a slow burn, the kind that needed tending, and she wasn't ready to fan the flame yet. Ruth visited often, sometimes with pastries, sometimes with nothing but a thermos of tea and her own company. They sat on the back porch, the early spring air sharp against their cheeks. Ruth never pressed for details about the meeting. Instead, she listened when Eleanor felt like speaking, and stayed silent when she didn't. "You're worth the work of healing," Ruth said one afternoon, her voice low but certain. "Don't let anyone rush you. Not even your..." Max began coming by on Sunday afternoons. He'd bring groceries or offer to help with small repairs. They didn't talk much about Claire, but Eleanor noticed a new caution in his manner, a respect for boundaries he hadn't always honored. She appreciated the gestures, but she also knew that reconciliation with him, like with Claire, would take time. She gave herself permission to move slowly. Some days she threw herself into tasks, repainting the kitchen cupboards, pruning the roses until the air smelled green, and other days she sat with her journal, untangling the knot of emotions that betrayal had left behind, anger braided with grief, relief threaded with doubt. The resentment, when it rose, was a heavy thing, but Eleanor began to notice that holding it didn't protect her, it only weighed her down. One rainy afternoon, she stood by the window watching water stream down the glass, and decided she could set some of it down, not for Claire's sake, but for her own peace. Letting go didn't mean opening the door. It meant choosing not to live in the shadow of what had been done. Claire's presence, however, was hard to avoid entirely. She sent occasional texts, brief, polite, almost tentative. Eleanor read them but rarely replied. When she did, her words were measured, never inviting more than she was willing to give. She told herself she was protecting her boundaries. She was also, if she was honest, protecting her heart. The weeks slipped into months. The garden bloomed again, the basil in the window box, sending up bright green shoots. Eleanor started walking the river path in the early mornings, the mist curling low over the water. She began to notice how her chest felt lighter, how her steps had more steadiness. One evening she sat at her desk sorting through old letters, holiday cards, notes from friends now gone. She found herself thinking about how relationships carried seasons, some lush and full, some bare, waiting for regrowth. Whether she and Claire would see another spring was still unknown. She was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't a gift she gave to someone else. It was a space she cleared for herself, a clearing where she could stand without fear or bitterness clouding the air. It was in that space, quiet, hard won, that the message came. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lit with Claire's name. Eleanor hesitated, then opened it. The text was longer than any she'd received since the trial. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't have the right to ask for more, but I'm asking anyway. One more chance to talk. No agenda, just me trying to make things right." Eleanor set the phone down, her pulse quickening. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the window, as if the night itself was waiting for her answer. She stared at the message, knowing that whether she replied or not, the choice she made next would shape the rest of their story. "I didn't need Claire's approval, I just needed to approve of myself." The message from Claire stayed unread for a day, then Eleanor didn't ignore it out of spite. She simply knew she wasn't ready. Healing wasn't a sprint. The door to her life would only open when she decided, and on her terms. So instead of answering, she began making plans that had nothing to do with Claire. One quiet morning, she cleared the kitchen table and unfolded an old map. Her finger traced a thin blue line along the coast, places she'd dreamed of visiting back when the children were small, when money was tight and time was tighter. She circled 3 towns in red ink. She started calling people she hadn't seen in years. Some calls led to lunches, others to long walks in the park. There were warm hellos, easy laughter, and the kind of conversation that didn't need to tiptoe around the last year. Max, true to his word, became a regular presence again. He fixed a creaky step on her back porch, brought over groceries, and sometimes just sat with her on Sunday afternoons, telling her about work. There was still a line between them, a knowledge of what had happened, but now it was a line they both respected. Claire, meanwhile, stayed on the periphery. Her messages came every so often, short, careful, without expectation. Eleanor replied occasionally, but only when she wanted to. She'd learned the difference between politeness and obligation, and she no longer blurred the two. Then came the morning she spotted the for lease sign in the window of a small shop on the corner. The building had tall windows, sun spilling across its worn wooden floor. She stopped, imagining it filled with shelves of handmade goods, stacks of books, pots of basil and rosemary in the window. That night, she wrote down the idea in her journal. The next day she called the number on the sign. A month later, the window box opened its door. Ruth helped paint the shelves a soft sage green. Max assembled tables. Eleanor spent evenings arranging displays, jars of preserves, local pottery, a corner for coffee and tea. She'd always wanted something of her own, something that wasn't tied to anyone else's name or permission. Opening day surprised her. Friends came from across town. Curious neighbors drifted in, and the place filled with the hum of voices. People lingered, thumbing through books, smelling the herbs, sipping coffee. It felt alive in a way she hadn't realized she'd missed. A local paper wrote a feature, "Local Woman Builds New Chapter After Legal Battle." The headline made her smile, not because of the battle part, but because of the new chapter. The photo they used showed her behind the counter, sunlight streaming over her shoulder. Claire came by once, weeks later. She walked in slowly, hands in her coat pockets, scanning the shelves. She picked up a ceramic mug, ran her fingers along its rim, then looked at Eleanor. "It's beautiful," she said. Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." That was all. There was no hug, no long conversation, but there was no anger either. By late summer, the window box had regular customers. Eleanor learned their names, their orders, the small details of their lives. The bell over the door became her favorite sound, each chime another reminder that she'd built something from nothing. The past was still part of her, but it no longer held her hostage. She had kept her home, her dignity, her autonomy, and she'd gained something new in the process. One Tuesday morning, she walked into the bank with a folder tucked under her arm. The teller smiled as Eleanor slid her ID and paperwork across the counter. "This will be a new account?" the teller asked. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "For my business. Just my name on it." The teller stamped the documents, the sound crisp in the quiet air. Eleanor slipped the papers into her bag and walked out into the sunlight, a small smile curving her lips. Independent, free, and certain that whatever came next, it would be entirely on her terms. "They gave me a paper plate. I built a new table." Thanksgiving morning began with the smell of roasting squash and cinnamon drifting from the oven. Outside, the air was bright and cold, the frost painting silver edges on the garden. Inside, Eleanor moved through the kitchen with calm efficiency. This year's guest list wasn't about obligation, it was about choice. She'd invited the people who had stood beside her when the ground felt unsteady. Ruth, her constant anchor, neighbors who'd become friends, regular customers from the window box who had become part of her weeks. Even Latham from across the street, bearing the green bean casserole she brought to every gathering since 7. On the table, Eleanor placed her fine china plates she'd once saved for the kind of dinners where silence held more weight than conversation. Today, they were for use, not display. Around them, mismatched serving bowls brimmed with mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, cranberry chutney. By early afternoon, the house was alive with movement. The clatter of spoons against ceramic, the rise and fall of overlapping voices. From the kitchen came a burst of laughter as Ruth shooed someone away from the pies cooling on the counter. Eleanor was setting a basket of rolls on the table when the door opened. Max stepped in, shoulders dusted with cold, holding a pie in both hands. "Pumpkin," he said simply, placing it on the counter. There was no speech, no apology wrapped in careful words, just a quiet offering, and the small, steady look they exchanged before he joined the others. When everyone was seated, Eleanor stood at the head of the table. Conversations quieted. The rustle of napkins and the faint hiss of the radiator filled the space. "I've learned something," she began, her voice carrying just enough to reach each corner of the room. "Sometimes life hands you a paper plate and expects you to be grateful. But you can build your own table, invite the people you choose, serve what's real." She lifted her glass. To worth, to peace, and to choosing both, every day. Glasses rose around the table. There was no forced cheer, no strained politeness. The first bites were taken, and the warmth in the room deepened. People spoke about the food, the changing season, small stories from their week. Laughter came easily, filling the spaces where silence used to sit heavy. Eleanor caught Max watching her once or twice, his expression softer than she remembered. Ruth leaned toward Mrs. Latham to compliment her casserole, and the two women fell into animated conversation. Hours passed in a comfortable rhythm, plates emptied and filled again, coffee steamed in mugs. A story about a camping trip gone wrong had the whole table laughing so hard, Eleanor had to set down her fork. When the last slice of pie was gone, Eleanor began stacking plates, the fine china cool and smooth in her hand. She carried them to the sink, rinsing each one before setting it carefully in the rack. From the kitchen doorway, she glanced back at the dining table. It sat bare now, except for a single half-full glass of wine left behind. The chairs were slightly askew, the linen creased, the wood still warm from resting arms. For years this table had been a stage set for performance, for meals where appearances mattered more than connection. Today it had been something else entirely, a place where she felt present, unguarded, surrounded by people who came because they wanted to, not because they had to. She crossed the room, letting her fingers rest lightly against the polished edge. The grain felt smooth under her touch, the surface carrying the echo of shared voices. Eleanor smiled, not at the food, or even the company, but at the quiet certainty settling in her chest. This was her life now, chosen, built, free from guilt, free from control, and she intended to keep it that way. This wasn't just a fresh start, it was the life I'd forgotten I could have. The mornings belonged to her now. No alarms set for someone else's schedule. No mental tally of tasks meant to prove her usefulness. Eleanor woke when the light reached her curtains, brewed coffee in her favorite chipped mug, and stood at the kitchen window watching the street come alive. Fear no longer anchored her days. She didn't glance at the mailbox with dread or measure her steps around her home like she was living on borrowed ground. The house felt entirely hers, not because of the deed, but because the shadow of losing it had finally lifted. Claire's voice, once a constant thread in her thoughts, had become faint, like a song from another room. Messages still came now and then, short and polite, but they grew less frequent. Eleanor answered when she wanted, without the pull to smooth things over or close a distance she hadn't created. Max visited more often, always calling first. He brought small things, a loaf of bread from a new bakery, photos from a hike, sometimes just himself and a story. Eleanor listened, shared a cup of tea, then let him go without offering to pack leftovers or remind him of errands. She was his mother, yes, but not his keeper. The extra time she hadn't realized she'd been spending on defense, she poured into herself. Painting came first. She set up a small easel in the sunroom, the glass jars of brushes lined like a bouquet. She painted what she saw, the cracked blue flower pot by the porch, the silvering leaves in the garden, the way morning light touched the wood floor. Yoga followed. At first she laughed at herself, wobbling through poses, but she kept at it until she could fold forward without thinking about balance at all. It wasn't about fitness. It was about inhabiting her own body without tension. One afternoon, Ruth leaned against the counter at the window box, sipping chamomile tea. "You should write this down," she said. "All of it. What happened, how you fought, how you built this." Eleanor smiled. "I'm already writing it," she said, gesturing toward the shop, the shelves of herbs, the corner table where neighbors lingered over coffee. "Not on paper, here, in how I live." Outside, late autumn sun spread gold across the sidewalk. She stepped out, locking the shop behind her, and stood for a moment with the keys warm in her palm. Across the street, a boy tugged his mother toward the bakery. 2 doors down, someone opened a window and shook out a blanket. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. This little strip of shops, these familiar faces, this rhythm, it was hers. Not because she owned every piece of it, but because she had chosen to stand in it, unafraid. She thought about all the years she'd measured her worth by the stability she could give others, the peace she could keep at her own expense. Now, she measured by something else entirely, how fully she occupied her own life. The shop window caught her reflection, hair a little wind-blown, scarf tucked loosely around her neck, eyes clear. There was no one left to convince. No approval she needed to earn. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She didn't check it right away. Whoever it was could wait. The sun was dipping, and the light across the storefronts was too beautiful to rush past. She took a slow breath, letting it fill her chest. This was the kind of quiet she'd once thought impossible, the kind that didn't feel like absence, but like presence. The streetlight above her flicked on, spilling a soft circle of gold over the sidewalk. She glanced once more at her shop sign swinging gently in the breeze, then at the street stretching out ahead. Eleanor turned toward home, the keys still warm in her hand. She didn't need permission to step forward. The life she'd built, rooted steady, entirely her own, was all the proof she would ever need, and for the first time, she felt whole.